When Dr. Gruber first appeared, there was a murmur throughout the group. There's my dermatologist. A lot of folks here have seen you under professional reasons as well. Let me tell you something about Dr. Gruber. I don't think he's going to admit to all this so readily, but of course the first thing I heard was, there's my dermatologist, but I never heard that he went to Harvard and Harvard Medical School, and in the course of his career, his very distinguished career, president of the Dermatological Society of New Jersey, a great honor, and he's a Summit Health graduate, come to us here at Old Guard. And Gabe, want to come up?
Thank you, Pete. When I submitted my application for membership to the Old Guard last year to Steve Varley, I filled in the part of the application form asking for place of birth and filled it in with Shanghai, China. I received an immediate email from Steve who asked, were your parents in the diplomatic corps? Were they in the military? Were they medical missionaries or none of the above? I replied to Steve saying, none of the above, it's actually a long story, and had a chance to explain that to Steve later. Last September, when September birthdays were celebrated and each of the members who came to the front of the room to describe their date of birth and place of birth, I again mentioned Shanghai. And after that meeting was approached by a few members who again had questions. What were your parents doing there? Why didn't they come directly to the United States? What I'll try to do in the next few minutes is to answer some of those questions and to explain how and why my parents ended up spending 8 years in Shanghai, China. In addition, I'll try to go over some historical facts of the events leading to their leaving Vienna, some of the attributes of life for the refugee community of Shanghai, details also a little bit about the international presence in Shanghai, eventually the role of the Japanese, and finally the events at the end of the war.
In here first.
So during the Second World War, approximately 18,000 Jews were able to flee Europe to Shanghai, China. While the so-called final solution was taking place, my parents were fortunate to be among that group of 18,000. Shanghai had no requirements for a visa, for an affidavit, for a police certificate, or for assurance of financial independence. Very simply stating, these are the reasons that the refugees were able to go to Shanghai, and we'll talk more about that later. The political situation in Europe in 1934, as an overview, Austria had a population of approximately 7.5 million people. Vienna had 2 million, of whom 200,000 were Jewish. The National Socialists by 1933 had shown themselves to be an extreme fascist party that had anti-Semitic overtones. Hitler was originally from Austria, and he expressed unification of German-speaking countries. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were passed, making Jews legally different from others. And when Hitler published Mein Kampf, he blamed the ills of the world basically on a Jewish conspiracy. This is a photograph of my parents, Edith and Armin Gruber, this is their wedding picture in Vienna, August 15th, 1937. Never did they dream at that time about the events that were going to take place in the next year and a half. On March 11th, 1938, the Anschluss took place. Basically, Germany announced the annexation of Austria. On the radio, the Austrian chancellor announced capitulation, stating, "God save Austria." German forces marched into Vienna and were greeted with jubilation. It was a very carefully orchestrated entry into Vienna with flags and banners being dropped from windows and the troops being welcomed, with the idea of one land, one people, one leader. In the first week after the Anschluss, there was dismissal from posts in public libraries, community centers, and theaters from Jewish employees. On March 15th, Jewish judges were removed and other state officials were fired, and legal cases involving Jewish citizens were stopped. On March 26th, there was firing from posts at colleges and universities and later from the lower schools. March 31st, lawyers were prohibited from practicing law, and there were displays of public humiliation and vandalizing of cemeteries. There was a decree that all Jewish citizens were required to present themselves at government offices and to provide lists of possessions and bank accounts. It's interesting, Lynn and I were in Vienna in the year 2000, and we had an opportunity to track down these lists, which are still maintained in this office building in one of the suburbs of Vienna. Shortly after the annexation of Austria in the spring of '38, some of the citizens started efforts to try to leave Austria. The big challenge was to find countries who were willing to accept immigrants. Shanghai, however, had an open door policy. Interestingly, there were many of the Viennese and German Jews as well who felt that, why should they leave? Their first allegiance was to their countries. Austrians, including my grandparents, stated, they were Austrian citizens who happened to be of the Jewish faith, so why leave at this point? In the spring of 1938, President Roosevelt convened a conference known as the Evian Conference, which took place in Evian, France, on the shores of Lake Geneva, with representatives from 29 countries who met to try to search out a solution for the Jewish refugee crisis, which had grown since the Anschluss. At that time, the United States had a strict quota system that was filled for the next 3 years. Britain, at the time, refused to discuss Palestine as a possible destination. But they did agree to a kinder transport, which involved allowing 10,000 children to go to foster homes in Britain, and those children traveled via the Netherlands. There was an article in the New York Times actually last month about new documents that were discovered about the details of the kinder transport. I think one of the questions raised was, why was the number capped at 10,000? And basically the reason was that foster parents needed to be obtained who were willing to accept the kids. Australia at the time expressed a concern regarding importing a, quote, social problem, and Latin American countries were unwilling to import so-called traitors or intellectuals. The real problems began after Kristallnacht, which was the night of broken glass, November 9th and 10th in 1938. There was vandalism and destruction of Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, and homes, and 30,000 Jewish males in Germany and Austria, aged 16 to 60, were rounded up and arrested and taken to concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. This was really the first time of a massive number of arrests by Nazi officials of Jews, specifically because of their religion, without any further cause for arrest. and nearly 100 Jews were murdered at the time of Kristallnacht. More than 1,000 synagogues were destroyed and 7,500 businesses were demolished. In Vienna, more than 6,500 Jews were arrested and herded into public buildings. One of those happened to have been my father. Those who could not prove that they were about to leave Austria were those who were taken to Dachau. In trying to figure out who was picked up and who was not, from my reading and from what I had heard, it was very difficult to determine. It was somewhat random. My father's older brother and my mother's older brother were not taken. One of the sources said they tried to pick on people who were politically active or who were wealthy. My father was neither of those. But at any rate, those who couldn't prove that they were ready to leave Austria at that time were taken to Dachau. As it was stated in many references, Kristallnacht shattered more than just windows and glass, but the deeply entrenched illusion of security and rootedness for the Jewish population. Because there had been a Jewish presence in Germany and Austria for 16 centuries, with Jews becoming more and more assimilated and being involved in areas of culture and science and scholarship. One of the references referred to the question of Jews in Germany and Austria during the first third of the 20th century, living in what they described as a, quote, fool's paradise. With regard to the Dachau concentration camp, it was the first Nazi concentration camp in Germany, established in March of '33, about 5 weeks after Hitler became chancellor. It's built at the edge of the town of Dachau, which is about 12 miles north of Munich, not a long distance really from Vienna. It became a model and training center for all of the other SS organized camps. The main camp was supplemented by 150 small branches scattered throughout Germany and Austria, which collectively were referred to as Dachau. The camps for central and northern Germany, that is for people in Berlin or in Hamburg, were Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. In the course of history, 160,000 prisoners passed through the main camp, 90,000 through its branches. About 32,000 died from diseases or malnutrition, physical oppression, namely beatings or execution, but there was no organized killing at that time. The initial inmates in Dachau were the so-called enemies of the state, namely Social Democrats, Communists, Socialists, and other political prisoners. Later victims were gypsies, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses. Most of the Jews were brought there after Kristallnacht, although there had been a few Jewish inmates earlier that year. And they were told they would be released if they would immediately immigrate. But that was the big challenge. So originally, prisoners were there to carry out forced labor. Luckily, at that time, my father was in good physical condition and he was able to withstand the labor. A few of his friends perished. It sounded like mainly from various sorts of infections that were not adequately treated. After 1942, there was transfer of some of those prisoners to the extermination camps. I think of note is the fact that Dachau was used as the chief camp for Christian clergy who were imprisoned for not complying with the Nazi party line. 2,720 clergy were recorded as being imprisoned at Dachau. 2,579 Catholic, 109 Protestant, 22 Greek Orthodox, 2 Muslim, and several other denominations. Lynn and I had the opportunity to visit Dachau during a trip to Germany. The original camp was destroyed after the war, and then it was rebuilt with the new buildings mimicking the old original structures, and it's used now as a teaching site for students. It has a very large parking lot that was filled with school buses when we were there. going to show just a brief video about a Chinese diplomat who provided exit visas for many of the Jewish residents of Vienna who eventually made it to Shanghai.
In 1937, diplomat Fengshan He Fengshan, was posted to the Republic of China Embassy in Vienna. The following year, Nazi Germany annexed Austria and began rounding up and killing the Jews there. This prompted Jewish people to apply by the thousands for visas at consulates in a bid to escape Nazi persecution. During this period, visas meant the difference between life and death. But most countries were unable or unwilling to provide them. As the ROC Consul General in Vienna, He was unwilling to simply stand by as Jews faced imprisonment and death, and so took the courageous step of issuing visas for life that granted Jewish refugees safe passage to Shanghai. From there, they could travel to other destinations all around the world. One of the lucky visa recipients was 17-year-old Eric Goldstau. After applying at 50 different consulates with no success, Goldstau came to He, who issued 20 visas for the entire family. Sometimes people would stuff applications into He's car, and even then he would issue them visas. He was eventually transferred back to China in May 1940, but as he prepared to board his train to leave, he still managed to deliver a batch of signed visas to Jewish refugees waiting for him on the platform. No one knows exactly how many visas for life He issued while in Vienna from 1938 to May 1940. Former chief scientist of the Israeli Ministry of Science and Technology, Daniel Weiss, notes that without He's help, his parents would likely not have escaped from the Nazis.
He gave my parents, my father and my mother, visas to go to China, and they got there by boat to Shanghai. Shanghai at the time was half captured by the Japanese, but there was an area in which refugees, mainly Jewish refugees from Austria and Germany, were kept there.
He went his whole life without once going public with the story of his assistance to the Jewish refugees. It was not until his death in 1997 that family members mentioned in his obituary, published in a newspaper in San Francisco, that he had issued visas to Jews. Word spread, and he became known as the Chinese Schindler. In July 2000, the government of Israel awarded He the title Righteous Among the Nations as a show of gratitude. In January 2001, the government of Israel officially issued He a Righteous Among the Nations certificate and medallion, which were accepted by his son Manda He and daughter Manli He. In 2007, He was named an honorary citizen of Israel. In June 2008, the U.S. Senate passed Senate Resolution 588 to honor He for courageously saving the lives of thousands of Austrian Jews. In November 2008, a pair of bronze plaques commemorating He was unveiled at the former site of the ROC consulate in Vienna. On September 10, 2015, ROC President Ma Ying-jeou publicly commended He for saving the lives of thousands.
So the nature of Fengshan He's work was such that he saved a large number of people. I do not know, in fact, whether he was the source of my parents being able to leave Austria or not. In terms of Shanghai, as briefly mentioned before, did not require an entry visa or a police certification. For someone to leave and get into the United States, at least initially at that time, one needed to have a notation from the police saying that one was a, quote, good citizen, unquote. If one was imprisoned, immediately that status was taken away from them. Shanghai didn't require that. There was no passport inspection. There was no need for proof of financial independence. Financial assets had been frozen and other assets confiscated. Yet most of the people going to Shanghai viewed this as just being a temporary stopover. Next, I'm going to show just a very short trailer from a movie called The Port of Last Resort, which gives a sense of what the refugees saw when they arrived in Shanghai. Shanghai had the reputation of being a lawless, dangerous place that was somewhat exotic, that had a climate very different from the Austrian and German cities. And this little trailer is narrated by one of the refugees. I should mention that this movie and another one, which I'll reference later, are available on Prime Video.
How can I make it possible for you to feel the specific atmosphere of this extraordinary city? The many smells, ranging all the way from the burnt incense in temples to the carts in which human excrement was collected for fertilizer. The peculiar sounds and noises emanating from the great variety of people, from the poorest coolies to the wealthiest men in the world, from the lives of socially accepted taxi dancers to the puritanistic British society ladies. Shanghai was a fake, a phony, neither Occidental nor Oriental. And yet, God forgive me, she was the most exciting and unique city in the world. She was poison, and the old-time Shanghailanders were addicts who never could free themselves from being in love with her. Max Berger's Refugee.
The refugees arriving in Shanghai found the following. My parents left Vienna and traveled there by going first to Genoa, Italy, where they boarded a ship. The ship went across the Mediterranean to the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, eventually the Indian Ocean, and around by that route. They left in April, late April of '39, and arrived in May. Shanghai was the world's 7th largest port. It had a total population of about 4 million Chinese, but 100,000 foreigners, including Japanese. 18,000 refugees arrived between 38 and 41, mainly from Germany and Austria, but there was a group of 1,000 Polish Jews and 1,500 non-Jews, non-Aryans as well. There were 2 existing Jewish communities in Shanghai. There was a smaller group of Sephardic Jews who arrived from Baghdad by way of India in the lateral half of the 19th century. And many of these were successful business people, and some of them had positions of relative wealth. And there was a larger group of Ashkenazi or European Jews, mainly from Russia, who had gotten to China by way of Manchuria in the first quarter of the 20th century, and they were of more modest means. With regard to the group from Baghdad, there was a book that was published a few years ago, The Last Kings of Shanghai, which profiled 2 families, the Sassoons and the Kaduris, who were extremely wealthy and who provided a tremendous amount of support financially for the refugees who had arrived. Just to mention, historically speaking, The first Opium War ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanjing. And there were 5 Chinese ports that were opened up at that time, so-called 5 Chinese treaty ports, of which Shanghai was one. One of the others was Canton, and then there were 3 other cities. And it was that same treaty that had ceded the island of Hong Kong to the British in perpetuity. After the treaty, there were 2 Shanghais. There was Greater Shanghai, which was completely under Chinese jurisdiction with a primarily Chinese population. And there were the foreign concessions, which were unique international areas that had populations from around the world. And of these 60,000 non-Chinese, there were 20,000 Japanese, 15,000 Russians, 9,000 British, 5,000 Germans and Austrians who were non-Jewish, 4,000 Americans, and 2,500 French. And there was a continually fluctuating population. This is a map of Shanghai in the late 30s. I'm going to try to use the mouse just to point out a few things to you. Along the Wangpu River, where you see these black buildings here, this is the so-called Bund area, which was the financial center with banks and trading houses, and also some of the nicer hotels. The area west of here, including this green oval, was the international settlement where the British and Americans were located. The green oval is the British racetrack. Located just south and west of there was the so-called French concession. In this area, north of the river, was Hongqiu, which was the Japanese area that we'll talk more about in just a moment. Now, if you look at pictures of modern-day Shanghai, and you see the large skyline that's now visible, that is built along this shore of the river, which is the Pudong area. So that's just to keep in the back of your mind as we talk about these things. Now, there was a strong Japanese presence when the refugees arrived, and that was because of the Second Sino-Japanese War. There was a Battle of Shanghai that took place between the middle of August and the end of November in 1937 that resulted in Japanese occupation. That was a long battle, and was referred to in one of the books as Stalingrad on the Yangtze. It resulted in a lot of casualties of the Chinese. Likewise, around that time, there was a large battle in the area of Nanjing where 200,000 Chinese were killed, and there was a so-called rape of Nanjing with an estimated 20,000 to 80,000 rapes occurring. But after the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese took control of the all-Chinese city and that section, Hongqiu, that I pointed out to you, which was part of the international area. The remaining international settlements, that is the British and American and the French, remained independent. The big challenge for the refugees when they arrived was where would they live and what would they do? Housing was a major issue, as it is in our society today. But a committee or a series of committees were set up to help the refugees. There was an executive committee to deal with authorities in the foreign controlled sections, a finance committee to coordinate support from agencies abroad, a housing and settlement committee. Most of the refugees initially were put in temporary housing, almost dormitory-like housing, until they could find their own place. A medical care committee, an education and culture committee, an employment committee to help locate jobs, and a rehabilitation committee to help make refugees self-sufficient through loans. 2 foreign committees were very instrumental in providing support. One of these was a British organization, which was the Committee for German Jewry, that was set up in London in 1935 in response to the needs of victims of Nazi Germany. And this provided some financial support until August 39, when Great Britain was involved in the war. And then there was the American Joint Distribution Committee, or JDC, which is the organization with the greatest impact. And that organization continues to exist today and continues to be helpful for refugees who are fleeing from other parts of the world. In August 1939, immigration restrictions were imposed. Until then, there were no barriers to settling in the foreign sections, that is, French concession, international settlement, or the Japanese-controlled Hankyu area. To characterize these areas, the French concession was the residential, most beautiful section. It had broad avenues, very few factories. It also had higher rents. There were 4,000 refugees there until the establishment of the ghetto in May of '43. Most could afford just single rooms. My parents were lucky to end up living in the French concession twice, once after their initial temporary housing and once after the ghetto was taken apart. There was the international settlement where there were 1,500 refugees. This area had a lot of industrial sites, a lot of businesses, and fewer residential areas. And then there was Hankyu, known as Little Tokyo, that had a heavy industrial base, and the majority of the refugees ended up there. The rents were 75% less than the rest of the city, and that area was badly damaged during the Sino-Japanese War. Here you can see on the upper picture areas that were bombed out and buildings destroyed. Once the refugees arrived, those who lived there started to rehabilitate the area. There was new construction, and there were new bars and restaurants set up, one area becoming known as Little Vienna. Here is a photograph of some dormitory-style housing, which for most of the refugees was temporary, but for a significant number ended up being permanent. There were some of the refugees who, for a number of reasons, were either unable to find work or because of medical issues were not able to work, who ended up living in these dormitory-type situations. In Hankyu, some of the dorms and some of the small apartments did not have modern plumbing with indoor toilets. This is a photo of the cover of a very interesting and excellent book by an author, David Kranzler, entitled Japanese, Nazis, and Jews, that summarizes the history of this period in great detail. This book evolved from a PhD thesis, and the author functioned as an academic teaching in the New York area after he had written this book. The Japanese refrained from making any specific policy statements between December 38 and May of 39. They did not have any expressed anti-Semitism. In August of 39, they made a statement restricting further Jewish immigration. And immigration then was restricted to either relatives or refugees already in Shanghai, to a few people who had job contracts, or a few people who had put down deposits of guarantee money with the shipping companies. The certificate shown on the left is a certificate which my parents had obtained for my father's mother in hopes of trying to get her to Shanghai from Vienna. They also had similar certificates for both of my mother's parents. My father's father had passed away before then. So they tried to get their parents over to Shanghai, and unfortunately were unable to do so. But this was the type of certificate that was made available. Italy entered the war in June 1940, and that effectively closed the Mediterranean, which was the route used by the majority of refugees trying to get to Shanghai, as it was. In 1941, there were 1,000 additional refugees from Poland who arrived in Shanghai via Siberia, Manchuria, and Kobe, Japan. And following that, essentially the door to Shanghai was effectively shut or closed. This is a tab from an envelope of a letter that was sent by my father's mother. And just to point out, she did not have a middle name that was given of Sarah, but every Jewish female was required to put the name Sarah on any identifying information. So she had to put this on there for her return address. And you could see here the Nazi stamps on the bottom, and the Nazi stamps being here, and the open by censor designation there. Living conditions in Shanghai, just to mention, the average age of refugees was over 40. My parents were 10 or more years younger than the average. Few came with a working knowledge of English, which was the language of Shanghai's business world. English lessons were given, job training, and placement. When my parents eventually were part of a business or owned a business in the French concession, eventually they dealt with several languages, and German, of course, English being the main business language, French because they were in the French concession, and then some rudimentary Chinese, just very little. There were over 200 physicians in the group of refugees. A refugee hospital was established in 1939, and a German language medical journal was established to cover the treatment of some of the diseases that were not encountered before by the European physicians. The big challenge was treating a lot of infectious disease that was not seen in Austria or in Germany much. Dysentery, cholera, parasitic worm disease, and other infections. The signs here on the office, I don't know whether it shows on the slide, but the top sign was of a guy who's a general practitioner, and the bottom one here is a guy who treats diseases of the skin. So, cultural life. Many refugees who came over had been parts of the intellectual and artistic communities. There were a large number of professional musicians. Several newspapers were established, some schools were established. Children who came over with their parents were put in the existing schools, and some of the schools were sponsored again by some of the Sephardic Jewish population who had been there for several generations already. Most of the schools that were established for the refugees were set up on an English model. Libraries were established. Over 60 German language plays took place over the time of the war years, and there were several Yiddish theater productions. There was an organization called the Jewish Community of Central European Jews, or the Jewish Gemeinde, that was established. And they had an arbitration board which dealt with landlord-tenant disputes, small claims, marriage, divorce. The crime rate was surprisingly very, very low. The organization put their stamp on a variety of things. It's probably difficult to read, but the document on the right side of the screen is a translation of my birth certificate into English from German. Japan entered the war after Pearl Harbor, and when that took place, the Japanese took over entire Shanghai. The United States, the chief source of relief funds to the refugee community, was now at war, and the Japanese took over many American and British firms in Shanghai, which led to increasing unemployment among the refugees. And there was disruption of exports to the United States by the refugees and disruption of the import of relief aid. And this led to significant problems in terms of problems, especially leading to food shortages and malnutrition. And and people being unable really to afford necessities of daily living. People who were employed were able to support themselves or asked to support at least one other family, which my family were lucky to be able to do. And there were soup kitchens set up that were supported by the entire communities. Eventually, the Nazis started to put pressure on the Japanese to conform, not confirm, but conform to their idea of anti-Semitism. And in February of '43, the Japanese proclaimed the establishment of the Hongqiu ghetto for victims of Hitler in Shanghai. Initially, they referred to the victims as stateless refugees instead of Jews, and they referred to this as a designated area rather than as a ghetto. About half of the 16,000 refugees who lived and worked outside of the ghetto were forced to relocate. My parents were living in the French concession and had to move from there into the ghetto area, but they were allowed to continue to work in the French concession. Each of them got a ghetto card. This is my mother's ghetto card, which had to be periodically renewed, which allowed exit and entry into the ghetto. And there were 2 Japanese officers in charge of dispensing passes. One of them was named Goya, G-H-O-I-A, who referred to himself as King of the Jews and was known for his sadistic treatment of the refugees. There have been many things written about this guy and cartoons, political cartoons that have been published about him. Interestingly, the Russian Jews who had original Russian citizenship were exempt from being put into the ghetto. So the effects of the ghetto, basically people were put into crowded areas. My parents ended up sharing an apartment with another couple who were good friends from Vienna temporarily for those years between the establishment of the ghetto and the end of the war. There was further unemployment and the problems with malnutrition that I had mentioned previously. And the ghetto remained in place until September 3rd of 1945. So starting in the summer of 1944, Shanghai became the target of US airstrikes. And the purpose of that was to destroy Japanese shipping lanes and their presence in Shanghai. So they tried to neutralize supply depots, oil tanks, air bases. And there were blackouts and curfews, and there was disruption of electricity and water supply. Japanese stored ammunition in civilian areas. And in reading up on this initially many years ago, it was the first time that I had seen the concept of people being used as human shields. At any rate, the US Air Force would drop leaflets warning refugees to stay out of certain areas, and the next day or two or whenever the next bombing raid was going to be. There was one air raid on July 17th, 45 that led to 31 refugees being killed, one of whom happened to have been the president of the Communal Association. There were 250 wounded and 700 of that group were left homeless. I'm going to show another brief video.
Hey you guys, welcome back to Shanghai, China. Today I'm here in Hongkou district where between 1933 and 1945, around 18,000 Jewish refugees found safety from the Holocaust. They called it the miracle of Shanghai, and today many of the remnants from that time still remain.
It's a pretty hideous part of recent history that doesn't need much introduction. All in all, the Holocaust led to the deaths of some 6 million Jews. At the time, most countries in the world closed their doors to those trying to escape persecution. But 2 places welcomed Jewish refugees with open arms. One of them was Shanghai. Many of those refugees lived here in the former Jewish quarter, which later became the restricted area for stateless refugees, otherwise known as the Shanghai Ghetto, an area covering roughly 2 square kilometers.
When visiting for the first time, probably the first place you should visit is here, the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum. Let's go in.
The museum, located at the site of the former Ochal Mosh synagogue, one of only 2 remaining in Shanghai, was established in 2007. Created in 1927 by repurposing an existing building, the synagogue was the major venue where Jews gathered to perform religious rites during World War II. The museum also features a permanent exhibition hall displaying photographs and a short film about life at the time, a story exhibition hall presenting the lives of 27 Jewish refugees, and an atrium where events are often held. Things started to get tough for European Jews in Shanghai on February 18, 1943, with the publication of a proclamation written by the Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army, at the time in control of Shanghai, ordering all stateless refugees to pack up and move to the restricted area, which today we know as the Shanghai Ghetto. Many were forced to leave their existing homes and businesses around Shanghai and move to what was one of the poorest and most squalid areas in the entire city. The European Jewish population quickly set up new businesses and lives in the area, which was already home to some 100,000 Chinese. The White Horse Cafe was one such establishment. This place originally opened in 1939 and was a buzzing cafe, bar and nightclub for Jewish refugees and anyone else who wanted to come and hang out. You probably won't be able to tell, but the building here today was rebuilt from blueprints after the original one was demolished in 2009. It now stands 100 meters from its former location. Here on Zhoushan Road, many of the old apartment buildings Jewish refugees lived in still exist. The area was once known as Little Vienna because of its abundance of European bakeries, restaurants and delis. But conditions soon became tough once the restricted area for stateless refugees was set up, and these flats often housed up to 30 in each room. Horshan Park, once called Wayside Park, was created way back in 1917. During World War II, Jewish refugees often came here to find solace and to socialize. Today, the locals still do just that. On August 6, 1945, the US dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. This set into motion the end of World War II, and on September 3, the Shanghai Ghetto was finally liberated. Shanghai's Jewish refugees began to slowly leave, finding new homes in the United States, Australia, and Israel, among other places. This monument, together with a Chinese flag, was erected in 2014 to commemorate the thousands of Jewish refugees who found a home in Shanghai when they had nowhere else to go. 13,000 of their names are engraved right here. Today, not a single Jew living in Shanghai during that time remains here. But their memory certainly does.
After the end of the war, Jewish refugees gradually left to go to other countries. The majority wanted to go to the United States, and not everybody was able to do so. About 10,000, the largest number, initially went to Israel, which then was Palestine. My parents were able to come to the United States. They were able to get the appropriate affidavit through my mother's brother, who was able to leave Europe going west, came first to New York, ended up in Louisville, Kentucky, settled there and provided the papers for my parents and me. My father's older brother, who was part of the Shanghai group, tried to get in the United States, couldn't do so. He ended up going to Palestine and eventually went back to Vienna, where he lived out the rest of his life. Some of the group went to Canada, Australia, South America, and a few to Europe. Just to point out a couple of things here, these are my parents' original German passports from the Reich, which were not of any value or use at the point at the end of the war. This document here was put out as an alternative for the refugees from Austria in lieu of a passport, and was honored by the American consulate in Shanghai. And this was an immunization certificate. The only immunization required at that time was a smallpox vaccination. Just to point out also, this was the form filled out for my father here. I don't know whether you can make out the print, but basically it states underneath the area that's blacked out, he is stateless. And my mother, she is stateless. And here I am stateless. I was 10 and a half months when my parents left Shanghai. However, on this document, which is from the American consulate, it lists my name, that I was part of the Austrian quota, even though I was officially stateless. Here is my certificate of citizenship, at which point I was no longer stateless. And I was invited by my first grade teacher to give a presentation describing how my parents took the requisite course in US history and civics and qualified for citizenship. I'd like to just mention briefly a professor who has written two very interesting books, and I brought the books here. I'll put out here once we're finished. Professor Pan Guang, who is Dean of the Center of Jewish Studies at the Shanghai Center for International Studies and Institute of European and Asian Studies, which is a university in downtown Shanghai. Lynn and I saw an article about his speaking at Rutgers University in 2009, and we had planned a trip to go to China and thought that we would try to contact Professor Guang and mention to him that I had copies of some memorabilia from my parents that he might be of interest, and didn't really expect to hear from him, but we thought we would try. It turns out he did reply and said, please contact me when you know your itinerary and details. And sure enough, he arranged to have one of his junior faculty people pick us up from our hotel, drive us to his institute, and he had a little luncheon set up. And there at the luncheon were two young Austrian men who were studying there for a few months. They were putting in service time. I don't know whether they were conscientious objectors or academics, but they were there to study basically the refugee experience in Shanghai. This is his a brochure from his Center of Jewish Studies in Shanghai. And I will mention that Professor Guang was exactly my age. I mean, he was born in 46, I believe. And he really has almost made a career out of studying this experience of the Jews in China. So this is his book, The Jews in Shanghai. Again, I brought a copy I'll put out. And his book, The Jews in China. Just want to mention a couple of notable Americans who lived in Shanghai. One, Michael Blumenthal, who was the Secretary of the Treasury under President Carter. And then Lawrence Tribe, who is a professor of constitutional law emeritus who is a frequent commentator on MSNBC. Last year, actually February, late February, early March, the New York Philharmonic premiered in the United States a performance of an oratorio that was entitled Emigre, that was a piece of historical fiction about the Shanghai ghetto experience. And it had been premiered initially in Shanghai, and then was brought to the United States and was performed by the New York Philharmonic, which we had the opportunity to see. And the conductor for the New York program was from Shanghai, as were several of the singers, but they used, of course, the New York Orchestra. This particular show was then broadcast on PBS this last October as part of their Great Performance series, and I think you can access it now. If you look up Great Performances, you can watch that if there's any interest. This is a bibliography of some of the books that I accessed in preparation for this, and want to point out the two films. One, The Port of Last Resort, for which we showed the short trailer, and the other, Shanghai Ghetto. Each of these is very valuable because in each of these films, adults who were very young, either in their teens or in their 20s, and experiencing life in Shanghai, were interviewed for these films, and they really give you a detailed sense of what life was like there. And some of the people who were interviewed in the films are people who have written memoirs and are in that list of books. This particular book, Flight from the Reich, talks about individuals who left Europe, not necessarily only to go to Shanghai, but to go to other places. Our younger son, Jonathan, knew the two authors from his work and got some of the information for them, and so my parents are included briefly in this book. This is just a census form from the French concession. Each of the concessions, international areas, try to keep track of all of the people who were living there. And this was an advertisement for my parents' business in the French concession. I'll have to ask DJ to comment on the accuracy of the French. But at any rate, and here the same thing was listed in English. And here just a letter of reference for my father from the communal association there. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. I know there are several people in the organization who spent time in Shanghai more recently than I have. I'd be interested in any comments that they have. And
Were your parents aware that, well, do you know if your parents were aware of the German attempt to have the Japanese liquidate the ghetto by putting all the Jews on barges, towing it out to the sea and sinking them?
I don't know whether my parents were aware of that. I came across that in my reading, and luckily that they were never able to follow through with that. But there was a representative of the German military who came to Shanghai, and I'm not sure in what year, whether it was in 43 or late 42, and started to raise the question of whether there should be something done to that population, but I don't know exactly about the method.
Gabe, it was a very interesting talk. And we went to China in 2014. We went for 3 weeks, including Beijing, Shanghai. We did visit the synagogue in Shanghai. Has that changed all? And also, can you tell a little bit about the transportation in China, how the subways are a lot different than the US? You just can't go on a subway like you can in New York. They have like sliding gates and things.
I didn't have that much time on the subway.
Oh, because that's how we got to visit the synagogue.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Each city we went to, we picked up a tour guide and a driver.
Yeah, that's basically what we did too. We had a guide and a driver.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Has the synagogue changed at all? Or?
I'm not sure what the current status is of it.
Okay.
Gabe, thanks a lot. Americans need to be reminded of what has happened in many places, including during World War II, and they need to be reminded of a few brave people who risks everything. People know about Schindler, so I wanted to mention the guy who was responsible for the Kinder transport to London. His name was Nicholas Winton. A lot of you are nodding your heads. So there's a movie about him called One Life. Has anybody seen One Life? Oh, there we go. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. He was a stockbroker from a wealthy family in London, and he traveled. Have you seen it, One Life? You got to see it. Are you his wife? Yes. Okay, you're going to make him watch it on the... Yeah, okay, so you got some homework.
I do.
But to tell you a short, quick story, he traveled in Europe and he saw the conflict during the late 30s, and he wanted to help. And what he did, him and his mother arranged for the safe transport of 700 kids from Germany, and they had to overcome the British bureaucracy, which was formidable. But his mother was formidable too. For example, they had to pay 50 UK pounds as an entry into it. She wandered around, got the money. He didn't say anything about this to his friends, and somehow a wealthy American socialite got a hold of his notebook, and they made a brief announcement on one of the BBC programs. And all these people phoned in and said, I was one of these kids. So the big finality was they invited him to a BBC program called This Is Your Life or something like that. Something along the lines of 60 Minutes or that. So he sat in the front row and the announcer said to him, do you know who all these people are? And it was the people that he saved. It's a Hollywood movie, most of it's true, but it's worth seeing.
Thank you, Gabe. That was really fantastic. I must say, my story coming to the United States is a lot easier than yours. Taking a flight to JFK was easy. No, this was a formidable story. I have a question, but if I may, can I ask my guest, Carter Nance, if he has a question? Carter, can you hear me? Over there with your green sweater. Do you have any comments or question for Gabe?
Yes, I thought that was a wonderful presentation. I grew up as a kid in Shanghai in the French concession, and life was not too different than middle America. You went to school in your neighborhood at the Shanghai American School. You went to movies downtown, and we saw Wizard of Oz and whatever came along. and we were completely, as kids, unaware of the Jewish community. I found out about a lot about it since then. I love the presentation today. But as I say, Shanghai, for the people who lived in the international settlements, the French concession and the internationalist settlement, life was not much different than being in mainland of the United States. My father stayed, we were evacuated, the women and children were evacuated in 1941, well after the Japanese had taken over, but not before December 7th. My father stayed behind, and my grandfather stayed behind and was interned in one of the Japanese internment camps. Sadly, I never went back. But I would really like to emphasize this was just a great presentation. And it was something that, as a kid, you were completely unaware of that large Jewish community there.
Thank you.
May I ask you a question? What happened in China? Why Shanghai and not Beijing or Hong Kong or other places in the world? But mostly, why not Beijing and Hong Kong? Thank you.
Beijing was not one of the 5 treaty ports that had the access to, by the international community. In other words, that was all of, run by the Republic of China, whereas Hong Kong was entirely British. I think the fact that Shanghai had the various concessions that were independently run and that were, at least prior to the 1940, these areas were generally left alone and self-governing, that is what facilitated it, as far as I know.
Gabe, thank you so much. This was a great presentation, and I learned so many things. I never knew most of this. It's really quite incredible. I had 2 questions. One, DJ covered one of them, so I'll get to the other one. And that was, once your parents came to the United States, what did they do? How did they adjust to life in America?
My parents settled in Louisville because my mother's brother had settled there. He met them in San Francisco, and we moved to Louisville. My parents eventually had a clothing business, retail clothing, in the city of Louisville, and they named it For You Clothing, which was the name of their business in Shanghai. As far as adjustment, I think, they gradually adjusted. They spoke English reasonably well, although with a very thick Viennese accent for a long time. They never acquired the Kentucky accent. And and I guess at one point I had that, but it got neutralized somehow. But, they, I think, enjoyed Louisville as a city very much. It's a middle-sized city that was very welcoming and a very pleasant environment in which to live.
We have our own rituals. You've seen one of these before, right? This is in honor of Dr. Gruber as speaker. This in honor of Dr. Gruber as a monthly program chairman. And I must say that we have had a wonderful month. Not only that, you had to do 5 instead of 4, which we appreciate. And we had medical, we had history, and especially this one, touching and right to the heart. and something we still need to think about. So I think you know about orchids and... Thank you very much. And one other, the old guard.